Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? A perplexing crime. It was a particularly dismal evening in London when a frantic knock shattered the quiet of 221B Baker Street. The rain had been drumming against the window panes for hours, and Holmes, stretched languidly upon the settee, had shown no inclination to rise. I had just set down my medical journal when Mrs. Hudson entered, breathless and flustered. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, stepping aside to reveal a tall, gaunt man with an air of desperation about him. His dark overcoat dripped with rain, his hat clutched tightly in his trembling fingers. Holmes sat up with a spark of interest. "Pray, come in, sir. You appear to have travelled in haste." The man stepped forward, his deep-set eyes darting about the room as though fearful of unseen pursuers. "Mr. Holmes, my name is Arthur Vance. I have come on behalf of Lord Ravenswood." He swallowed hard before continuing. "It is the matter of his daughter, Miss Eleanor Ravenswood. She has vanished without a trace." Holmes steepled his fingers, his gaze sharpening. Vanished? Under what circumstances? Vance hesitated. "It is not an ordinary disappearance, sir. The villagers whisper of the curse upon Ravenswood Manor." I scoffed. "Surely you don't mean to suggest—" "I mean only that she is the third to disappear within the manor's walls," Vance interjected. "All under the same inexplicable conditions. And my lord fears she will not be the last." A brief silence fell. The flickering gaslight cast long shadows upon Holmes's face as he regarded the man before him. Then, with a sharp nod, he rose to his feet. "Watson, we shall leave at once. I believe the game is afoot." A mysterious invitation. The rain had eased by the time our hansom cab rattled through the cobbled streets of London, but a thick mist still clung to the air, muffling the gaslights in a ghostly glow. Holmes sat beside me, his keen gaze fixed on the streaked window-pane, though I suspected he saw more in his mind's eye than in the dreary streets outside. Our visitor, Arthur Vance, had spoken little since we departed Baker Street, his hands clasped tightly together, the rhythmic tapping of his boot betraying his unease. It was only when we neared Charing Cross Station that Holmes finally broke the silence. "Tell me, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice smooth but firm, "this so-called curse, what do you make of it?" Vance exhaled sharply. "I am not a man given to superstition, Mr. Holmes, but I cannot deny that there is something unnatural about Ravenswood Manor. 3 disappearances, all occurring in locked rooms, without a single sign of forced entry or struggle. If it were merely Miss Eleanor, I would assume an abduction. But the pattern is undeniable." Holmes nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. "And the previous victims?" "The first was Lady Beatrice Ravenswood, Lord Ravenswood's late wife. That was nearly 5 years ago. Then, last autumn, his nephew, Henry Whitmore, vanished in precisely the same manner. And now Eleanor, his only daughter. Each case happened within the manor, behind closed doors, with no possible means of escape." I frowned. "And Scotland Yard?" Vance gave a humourless chuckle. "They investigated, of course, but with no evidence of a crime No bodies and no ransom. Demands, they eventually dismissed it as hysteria or mere runaways. His voice dropped. But I tell you, Dr. Watson, Miss Eleanor did not run away. Holmes studied him for a long moment, then leaned back, his fingers tapping against the polished wood of his walking stick. You have done well to seek me out, Mr. Vance. The case presents the necessary elements of intrigue and impossibility, two qualities I find most stimulating. He turned to me with a wry smile. Watson, I trust your bag is packed? I sighed, already resigned to the journey ahead. It never seems to remain unpacked for long. Vance produced a letter from his coat pocket and handed it to Holmes. Lord Ravenswood expects you. A carriage awaits us at the station. I trust you will find Ravenswood Manor most enlightening. Holmes took the letter with a glint of amusement, but as he unfolded the heavy parchment and his eyes scanned the words, his expression darkened ever so slightly. Curious, he murmured. A case of vanished souls. And yet, Lord Ravenswood does not request an investigator. I glanced at him. Then why has he summoned you? Holmes turned the letter toward me. Beneath the elegant script of Lord Ravenswood's invitation, a single chilling line had been hastily scrawled at the bottom in a trembling hand. Come at once, before the manor takes another. Shadows of Ravenswood Manor. The train ride to Ravenswood was spent in relative silence. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled, his gaze distant. I knew better than to disturb him in such moments. His mind was already at work, dissecting the puzzle before we had even reached our destination. Arthur Vance, however, remained restless. More than once I caught him rubbing his temples though warding off some unseen dread. "Tell me, Mr. Vance," Holmes finally said as the train whistled its approach to our station. "What of the manor itself? Do you believe the house to be, how shall I put it, unnatural in some way?" Vance hesitated before replying. "I cannot say, Mr. Holmes, but there is an atmosphere to it. The servants whisper of voices in the halls, doors that lock themselves, and figures seen only in the periphery of vision." His fingers tightened around his coat. "And then, of course, there is the East Wing." Holmes's brow lifted. "Ah, a particular source of misfortune, I presume." Vance nodded. Lady Beatrice Henry, and now Miss Eleanor. They all vanished from rooms within the East Wing. The wing has since been abandoned, save for the room where Miss Eleanor disappeared just 3 nights ago. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Most interesting." The train slowed, steam hissing as we arrived at a small, desolate platform. A single gas lamp flickered weakly against the heavy mist rolling off the moors. Waiting for us was a dark carriage, its driver hunched against the cold. "Ravenswood Manor is but a short distance from here," Vance murmured as we stepped inside. The journey through the countryside was quiet, save for the distant cry of some nocturnal bird. Then, as we rounded a bend, Ravenswood Manor loomed before us. It was an ancient, towering estate of weathered stone, its turrets and chimneys silhouetted against the moonlit fog. The house exuded an air of neglect. Ivy crept along the walls, and several windows stood dark and hollow. A pair of lanterns flanked the entrance, casting flickering pools of light against the heavy oak doors. As we stepped out, a chill that had little to do with the weather crawled down my spine. The doors creaked open before we could knock. A wiry butler with sunken eyes and an air of practised indifference stood before us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he intoned. "Lord Ravenswood is expecting you." We followed the butler through the grand yet faded halls, passing tapestries and portraits, whose painted eyes seemed to watch us. A single portrait caught my attention. Lady Beatrice Ravenswood, her pale, delicate features captured in an expression of quiet sorrow. At last, we entered a dimly lit drawing-room. A man sat in a high-backed chair by the fire, his posture stiff. He was gaunt, his once handsome face lined with deep-set exhaustion. His silver hair, though neatly combed, did little to mask his frailty. He turned toward us as we entered, his eyes sharp despite the weariness behind them. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." His voice was measured though strained. "You have come at a dark hour for my family." Holmes inclined his head. "Then let us waste no time, Lord Ravenswood. Tell me of the night your daughter disappeared." Lord Ravenswood exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering to the flames. "She retired to her chambers at 10 o'clock. I spoke with her briefly before then. She seemed in good spirits, though tired. By morning she was gone." His hands tightened around the arms of his chair. "The door was locked from the inside, the windows latched. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints in the hall, no cries in the night. And yet, she was simply gone." A long silence stretched between us. Holmes turned to Vance. "You said the east wing is abandoned." Vance nodded. "Save for Miss Eleanor's chamber." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then that is where we shall begin." The Vanishing Room. The east wing of Ravenswood Manor exuded a peculiar chill, the air thick with neglect and something less tangible, an oppressive stillness, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Our footsteps echoed as we followed Lord Ravenswood and Arthur Vance through the dimly lit corridor, the flickering candlelight casting long, shifting shadows. At last we arrived at the chamber where Eleanor Ravenswood had last been seen. The queue door was heavy, made of ancient oak reinforced with iron bands. Holmes paused before it, his sharp gaze scanning its surface. "You are certain, Lord Ravenswood, that this door was locked from the inside?" The older man gave a solemn nod. "We had to break it open the following morning. There was no other way in." Holmes traced a gloved finger along the edges of the doorframe, inspecting the iron keyhole with great care. Then, without a word, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was modest in size, though elegantly furnished. A four-poster bed draped in deep crimson, a writing desk, a wardrobe, and a single window framed by heavy velvet curtains. The air carried the faintest trace of perfume, as though Eleanor's presence still lingered. Holmes moved with careful precision, his keen eyes absorbing every minute detail. He ran a hand along the writing desk, then turned his attention to the wardrobe, which stood slightly ajar. He pulled it open, revealing only neatly arranged gowns and cloaks. "Her belongings remain untouched?" he asked. Lord Ravenswood hesitated, or save for the clothes she was wearing that night. Holmes's gaze flickered toward the window. He crossed the room, unlatched it, and pushed it open. A gust of cold air swept in, rustling the heavy curtains. Holmes leaned out slightly, peering downward into the thick fog that curled around the manor's foundations. Too great a height for any descent, he murmured, and no ivy or trellis to aid in escape. Vance, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. We considered the possibility of a hidden passage, Mr. Holmes. But the walls are solid stone, centuries old. If there is a secret exit, it has evaded us all. Holmes stepped back, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against his chin. Then, with sudden purpose, he knelt beside the bed and examined the rug beneath it. With a swift motion, he pulled it back, revealing the wooden floorboards. He rapped his knuckles against them, listening intently. A faint smile played at his lips. Interesting. Before I could ask what he had found, he rose and turned to Lord Ravenswood. Tell me, who had access to this wing on the night of Eleanor's disappearance? The older man exhaled, rubbing a weary hand across his brow. Very few. Myself, of course, Arthur, the housekeeper, Mrs. Wilton, and one other, Miss Eleanor's maid, Agnes Miller. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Agnes Miller, and where might I find her? Lord Ravenswood's expression darkened. She left the manor the morning after Eleanor vanished. No one has seen her since. A silence settled over the room. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who was now wearing the ghost of a smile. A missing maid, he mused, in a case of vanishing persons. He turned back toward the door, his steps brisk and assured. Come, Watson, I believe it is time we spoke with the staff. Whispers in the dark. The grand dining hall of Ravenswood Manor had seen finer days. A single chandelier flickered above, casting dim light over the long wooden table where the remaining household staff had assembled at Lord Ravenswood's request. Their expressions ranged from apprehensive to outright fear. Holmes stood at the head of the table, his fingers drumming lightly against the polished surface. He surveyed the group in silence for a long moment before speaking. Mrs. Wilton, he finally said, turning his attention to the housekeeper, you were among the last to see Miss Eleanor before she vanished. Tell me precisely what you observed that night. Mrs. Wilton, a severe-looking woman with streaks of silver in her tightly bound hair, folded her hands in her lap. Miss Eleanor retired to her chamber at 10 o'clock, as always. I brought her a cup of chamomile tea and wished her good night. She seemed a little distracted, but nothing out of the ordinary. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Distracted in what way? The housekeeper hesitated. She kept glancing toward the window, as though she had seen something outside. But when I asked, she dismissed it as nothing. Holmes hummed thoughtfully before shifting his attention to a nervous-looking footman. And you, Mr. Graves, where were you that evening? The footman swallowed hard. In the kitchen, sir, preparing for the morning's deliveries. Holmes inclined his head before addressing the remaining staff members, extracting similar statements. Finally, he turned back to Mrs. Wilton. Tell me about Agnes Miller. A collective unease passed through the room at the mention of the missing maid. She was a good worker, Mrs. Wilton admitted grudgingly. But she was prone to foolish fancies. She claimed to hear things in the East Wing, whispers in the night, footsteps in empty corridors. I told her it was nonsense, but she hesitated. The night Eleanor disappeared, Agnes was frightened. She told me something was terribly wrong. The next morning she was gone. A most convenient departure, I murmured to Holmes. Indeed, Watson, he said, though his eyes held an unreadable glint. "Tell me, Mrs. Wilton, did Miss Eleanor confide in Agnes?" The housekeeper pursed her lips. "They were close, yes. Agnes was more than a maid to her. She was a friend. If Eleanor had a secret, I dare say Agnes knew it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then I imagine it would be most enlightening to find her." At that moment a gust of wind rattled the windows, and a low creak echoed from the hall beyond. Every head in the room turned instinctively toward the sound. A footman made the sign of the cross. Holmes, however, showed no reaction beyond a flicker of amusement. "One last question," he said, returning his gaze to Mrs. Wilton. "You say the door to Eleanor's room was locked from the inside?" "Yes, sir. There was no other way in or out." Holmes nodded. "Fascinating." With that, he turned sharply on his heel and strode toward the door. I hurried after him as we stepped back into the corridor. "Holmes," I said in a low voice, "do you believe the maid is responsible?" "Responsible?" he chuckled. "No, my dear Watson, but she may very well hold the key to this mystery." He halted abruptly outside Eleanor's chamber and knelt beside the doorframe, running his fingers along the wooden moulding. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he produced a magnifying glass and examined something near the base of the door. A quiet hum of satisfaction escaped his lips. "Watson," he murmured, "tell me, what do you make of this?" I crouched beside him and followed his gaze. There, nearly imperceptible against the dark wood, was a thin scratch, a mark so subtle it might have been overlooked entirely. "A scratch on the door frame," I observed. "What of it?" Holmes smiled, slipping the magnifying glass back into his coat. "A door locked from the inside, a maid who fled in fear, and now a mark precisely where one should not be." He straightened, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. "I do believe our illusion is beginning to crack, Watson. But first, let us find Miss Agnes Miller." A second vanishing. The night had settled heavily over Ravenswood Manor. The moors beyond lost in shifting veils of mist. A lantern swung in my grip as Holmes and I trudged along a gravel path leading to the servants' quarters. The wind carried the distant hoot of an owl, but otherwise all was eerily still. "Do you truly believe Agnes Miller fled out of fear, Holmes?" I asked. "Or is it possible she was made to disappear?" Holmes's sharp profile was unreadable in the lantern glow. "Both are plausible, Watson. If Agnes knew something, if Eleanor confided in her, it would make her a liability to the very force that orchestrated this mystery. And yet she said nothing to the others," I noted. "Surely, if she had knowledge of something sinister, she would have warned them." Holmes's lips twitched. "Unless, of course, she did warn someone, and they ensured she would never speak again." We reached the modest structure housing the servants' quarters and knocked sharply. After a pause, the door creaked open to reveal a weary-eyed man in a nightshirt. "Forgive the intrusion," Holmes said briskly, "but we require information regarding Agnes Miller. Have you any notion of where she might have gone?" The man scratched his stubbled chin. "She left before sunrise, the morning Miss Eleanor vanished. Didn't say where she was going. Only that she wouldn't stay another night." Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Did she take her belongings?" I, packed in a hurry though, left some of her things behind. Holmes stepped forward. "Show me." The man hesitated but gestured us inside. We were led to a small, sparsely furnished room, Agnes's quarters. Holmes moved with precise intent, his fingers grazing the edges of the writing desk, the small chest of drawers. Then he paused, crouching near the bed. He reached beneath it and withdrew a discarded piece of parchment. The edges were crumpled, as though hastily stashed away. Holmes unfolded it carefully and held it toward the lantern light. Scrawled across the paper, in hurried but deliberate handwriting, was a single phrase. "The East Wing is waking." A silence settled between us. "The East Wing?" I murmured. "What in heaven's name does that mean?" Holmes's expression darkened. "It means we are far from done, Watson." At that moment, a distant crash shattered the quiet. I started, my hand instinctively reaching for my revolver. Holmes, however, was already in motion, bolting toward the manor with the speed of a man who had anticipated disaster. We reached the main hall just as Lord Ravenswood and Arthur Vance emerged from the drawing-room, their faces taut with alarm. "What was that noise?" Vance demanded. Holmes did not answer. He was already moving toward the grand staircase, his gaze lifted to the upper floors. Then, suddenly, he stopped. A single candle flickered in the corridor leading to the east wing. "Watson," he said softly, "someone is in Eleanor's chamber." Without another word, he ascended the stairs, his movements swift and soundless. I followed close behind, my pulse pounding. The door to Eleanor's chamber stood ajar. The flickering candle within cast wild shadows against the walls. Holmes entered first, his keen eyes sweeping the room. And then, we saw it. The wardrobe door was open. A chill ran through me as I stepped closer, my lantern's glow illuminating the inside. Hanging neatly on its rack was a row of Eleanor's dresses, untouched since her disappearance. But there, at the bottom of the wardrobe, lay something else, a single crumpled nightgown. Fresh footprints marred the dust-covered floorboards around it. "Holmes," I whispered, "someone has been here." Holmes crouched, his fingers brushing the fabric of the nightgown. It was still warm. He stood abruptly, his sharp gaze darting toward the open window. The heavy velvet curtains swayed gently, though no wind entered the room. Then, from somewhere, deep within the manor, a distant whisper. Holmes turned to me, his voice calm but urgent. "We are no longer chasing a disappearance, Watson. Someone or something is still inside this house. The trap is set." The grand halls of Ravenswood Manor had never felt so suffocating. The flickering candlelight danced across the wood-panelled walls, casting eerie, shifting shadows as Holmes and I stood in the threshold of Eleanor's room. The freshly disturbed nightgown lay at our feet, the scent of lavender clinging faintly to its fabric. Holmes's expression was unreadable, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the chamber. Then, with deliberate slowness, he stepped to the centre of the room and withdrew his pocket watch. "It is nearly midnight, Watson," he murmured, snapping the timepiece shut. "A most fitting hour for ghosts to walk." "Holmes," I said, lowering my voice, "you do not mean to suggest—" "I suggest nothing, my dear friend," he interrupted. "I merely observe, and what I observe is quite peculiar indeed." He turned on his heel and strode toward the heavy velvet curtains, still shifting ever so slightly from the unseen disturbance. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he pulled them aside. The window was closed, locked. The night beyond was thick with fog, the moors stretching endlessly beneath a silvered moon. Holmes exhaled softly, then glanced back at the wardrobe. "This," he murmured, "is no mere vanishing act. Our illusionist is still at play." I shuddered. "Then whoever was here has not fled." "On the contrary," Holmes said, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I suspect they never left at all." Before I could demand an explanation, he was already moving. He retrieved the nightgown from the floor, folded it carefully, and placed it back into the wardrobe, precisely where it had been. Then he stepped back, eyes gleaming with a calculated spark. "You see, Watson," he continued, "a magician relies on misdirection. While the audience stares at the flourish of his hand, the trick occurs elsewhere. Tonight, we have been staring too intently at the surface. It is time to watch the shadows instead." I frowned. "You mean to set a trap?" "Precisely." At that moment, the door to Eleanor's room creaked open. Lord Ravenswood and Arthur Vance stood there, their faces pale. "You heard it too," Lord Ravenswood murmured. It was not a question. Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, and we shall hear it again before the night is through." Vance took an uneasy step forward. "What are you planning, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes dusted his hands together as if settling into a game of chess. "A simple observation, Mr. Vance. I wish to see how the house breathes when it believes it is alone." He turned to Lord Ravenswood. "If you would be so kind, I require your cooperation. You, Watson, and I shall retreat to the drawing-room. The rest of the household must remain in their quarters until morning." "And then?" Lord Ravenswood asked, a slight tremor in his voice. Holmes smiled. "Then, my lord, we shall watch and wait." The drawing-room was dimly lit, the great fireplace casting restless shadows against the walls. Holmes sat in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze locked on the doorway. I sat across from him, my nerves coiled tight as a spring. Lord Ravenswood, still as stone, remained by the mantel, his features drawn. Time stretched. The clock on the wall ticked with maddening slowness. And then a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, a whisper of fabric against wood. I turned sharply toward Holmes, but he remained motionless, his eyes glinting with something close to satisfaction. Again the sound, a shift, a presence moving through the manor. Holmes rose soundlessly, his movements precise, like a predator closing in on its prey. He motioned for us to follow, and together we stepped into the corridor. The candlelight flickered as a draught whispered through the air. The manor, ancient and brooding, seemed to inhale around us. Holmes led us toward the east wing. My pulse thundered as we approached Eleanor's chamber. The door stood ajar, precisely as we had left it, and then a shadow. A figure moved within the room. Holmes raised a hand, signalling us to remain silent. Then, with the grace of a man who had anticipated every moment, he stepped forward. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight. The shadow inside the chamber froze. Holmes struck like lightning, lunging forward and seizing hold of the unseen intruder. There was a strangled gasp, a brief struggle. Then the flickering candlelight illuminated the face of the captive. A young woman, pale, breathless, her dark eyes wide with terror. Lord Ravenswood let out a choked sound, his hands trembling. "Agnes!" The maid's lips parted, but no words came. She was shaking violently, her gaze darting toward the wardrobe. Holmes's grip remained firm. "Miss Miller," he murmured, his voice gentle but unyielding. "I believe you have a great deal to tell us." Her hands clenched into fists. Then, finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she uttered a single chilling sentence. "She told me to hide. She said he would come for her next." A silence more profound than death settled over us. Holmes met my gaze. "The game," he murmured, "is afoot. Holmes unmasks the illusion." Agnes Miller trembled in the dim candlelight, her fingers clutching the fabric of her apron, as if grounding herself against some unseen terror. Her eyes darted between us, hollow and frightened. Lord Ravenswood's breath came in uneven bursts, and Arthur Vance stood rigid, his face unreadable. Holmes, however, remained the picture of calm precision. He released his grip on Agnes and took a slow step back, his keen gaze fixed upon her like a blade pressing against the truth. "You said Eleanor told you to hide," he murmured, his voice smooth but edged with intent. "Because he would come for her next. Who is he, Miss Miller?" Agnes swallowed hard. I don't know. She never said a name, but she was afraid. She was certain someone in the house wanted her gone." Holmes nodded, as though confirming something to himself. "And so you did the only thing you could. You vanished." Tears brimmed in Agnes's eyes. "I didn't know what else to do. I wanted to run, to leave Ravenswood Manor forever, but I couldn't abandon her. So I hid, waiting for a chance to help her." Her gaze flickered toward the wardrobe, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "I was too late." A heavy silence fell upon the room. The shadows stretched long and deep, wrapping around us like unseen spectres. Then Holmes turned sharply toward Lord Ravenswood. "My lord, may I trouble you for the keys to the East Wing?" Lord Ravenswood blinked. "The East Wing?" Holmes extended his hand, fingers expectant. "If you please." There was a moment of hesitation before Lord Ravenswood withdrew a heavy iron keyring from his pocket. He handed it over without a word. Without another glance, Holmes strode toward the door. "Come, Watson, Miss Miller, you will accompany us." Agnes flinched. "The East Wing? No, I cannot go back there." Holmes gave her a measured look. "You were willing to stay hidden in this house for Eleanor's sake, but now you would abandon her completely." The girl wavered, her fingers twisting together. Then, with a small, shuddering breath, she nodded. We moved through the darkened corridors in silence, the air thick with dust and something heavier, something unspoken. The East Wing was seldom used, its corridors colder than the rest of the manor, its silence more profound. Holmes reached a set of double doors at the end of the hallway and inserted the key. The lock groaned in protest, and with a sharp twist, the doors swung open. The room beyond was large but barren. Faded tapestries clung to the walls, and sheets covered forgotten furniture. A single candle burned on the mantel, the wax pooling onto the stone, and then, against the farthest wall, We saw it. A door, smaller than the others, almost hidden within the wooden panelling. Holmes strode toward it, his fingers trailing along the edges. He pressed against the wood, and with a soft click, the door swung inward. A passage, narrow, suffocating, stretching into blackness. Agnes let out a small gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Eleanor used to speak of these passages, she whispered. She said the manor was full of them, secrets left by the ancestors of the Ravenswood line. Holmes stepped inside, his lantern casting flickering light against the stone. I followed, my heart hammering. The passage twisted and turned, the walls damp and cold. Then, abruptly, it opened into a larger space, a hidden chamber, long abandoned. Dust swirled in the lantern glow, revealing an old wooden table, scattered papers, and a single chair. And upon that chair, secured by rope, was a woman's figure my breath caught. Eleanor! But Holmes's hand shot out, gripping my arm. No, he said quietly. The figure did not move, did not breathe. The stillness was absolute. I stepped closer, my stomach tightening. The flickering light revealed Eleanor Ravenswood's features, her porcelain skin drained of colour, her eyes closed as if in sleep. But the bruising around her throat told a darker story. Agnes let out a strangled sob. No, no, she can't be. Holmes crouched beside the lifeless form, his gaze sweeping over the body. Then carefully, he reached into her sleeve and retrieved a small scrap of paper. He unfolded it, eyes narrowing. I peered over his shoulder. 3 words had been scrawled in hurried, uneven script. It was him. A chill slithered down my spine. Holmes rose to his feet and turned toward the door. "Come, Watson," he said briskly. "It is time to unmask our magician." The magician unmasked. We stood in the hidden chamber, the air thick with dust and something colder. Finality. Eleanor Ravenswood's lifeless form remained bound to the chair, her final message clutched in Holmes's hands. It was him. The words were scrawled in desperation, yet they remained incomplete. Holmes's sharp gaze flickered toward the passageway. "We have seen enough," he murmured. "Come, Watson. The curtains must fall on this performance." Agnes was still trembling, her hands clasped over her mouth, eyes brimming with unshed tears. I placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her away from the grim spectacle. Holmes led the way, his every step deliberate, as though each movement pieced together the final strokes of his grand design. As we emerged from the east wing, Lord Ravenswood and Arthur Vance stood waiting in the main hall. The tension in the air was palpable, an unspoken dread hanging between them. Lord Ravenswood's gaze darted to Agnes. "What happened?" His voice wavered. "Did you find her?" Holmes strode past them, setting the scrap of paper upon the great oak table in the centre of the room. The candlelight flickered across its surface, illuminating the haunting message. "We found Eleanor," Holmes said simply. "And we found her murderer." A gasp. Agnes clutched my arm, her body rigid. Vance stiffened, while Lord Ravenswood took a step forward, his face ashen. "Murder," he whispered. "No, but who?" Holmes turned toward him, his hands clasped behind his back. "That, my lord, is the final act of our illusionist's performance, and I dare say—" His eyes flashed toward Arthur Vance. It is time for the magician to take his bow. Vance's reaction was instantaneous. His head snapped up, his expression one of shock, then rapidly shifting to anger. "You cannot be serious, Holmes," he spat. Murder? That is absurd." Holmes tilted his head ever so slightly, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "Is it?" he mused, "or is it merely unexpected?" Lord Ravenswood looked between them, bewildered. "Mr. Holmes, you must explain yourself." Holmes inclined his head. "With pleasure. But first, a question for our esteemed Mr. Vance." He turned sharply, his gaze like a dagger. Where were you on the night Eleanor vanished?" Vance's mouth opened, then closed. I had retired early," he said stiffly. "Lord Ravenswood can confirm that I did not leave my quarters." Holmes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Indeed, Lord Ravenswood can confirm you entered your quarters, but who is to say how long you remained?" He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "Tell me, Vance, why did Eleanor write it was him? Who was she referring to?" Vance's hands clenched. "How should I know? She could have meant anyone." Holmes sighed. "You disappoint me, sir. I had hoped for a more spirited defence. No matter. It is irrelevant. The truth is already laid bare." He turned toward Lord Ravenswood and Agnes, addressing them both. "The answer has been before us from the beginning. Eleanor was afraid. She knew someone in this house meant her harm, yet she did not name them outright. Why? Because she already had. She confided in someone she trusted, Miss Miller." He gestured toward Agnes, whose breath hitched. "Me," she whispered. "Indeed. You told us Eleanor feared for her life, that she knew someone wished to harm her. And yet, if you recall, when we first arrived, Mr. Vance was already aware that Eleanor was missing. Curious, considering no one had yet confirmed it to him." Lord Ravenswood's face paled. But Vance has served this family loyally for years. What motive could he possibly have?" Holmes exhaled, as if disappointed in the simplicity of it all. "Greed, my lord, the oldest motive of them all." He turned back to Vance, who had gone rigid. "Eleanor was set to inherit Ravenswood Manor, was she not? And as it happens, Mr. Vance has recently found himself in dire financial straits. Rather inconvenient, I imagine, to serve a family that would soon be led by a woman who had no real need for his counsel." Vance's fists clenched at his sides. "This is slander," he hissed. Holmes raised an unimpressed brow. "Oh? Then let us discuss the illusion you so carefully crafted." Eleanor did not disappear by magic. She was taken, carried through the very walls of this house, using the forgotten passageways. And where was she hidden? Not far, just beyond the east wing, where none would think to look. You placed her there, hoping to buy time before anyone discovered the truth. "That is preposterous," Vance snapped, his voice rising. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Is it? And yet you knew of those passageways, did you not?" Vance's lips pressed. "Together." Holmes gave a small, satisfied nod. "I thought as much. But the most damning proof of all is Eleanor's own words, her final desperate message. It was him." A cry of recognition. "She knew you, Vance. She trusted you, and you betrayed her." The room fell into a thick, suffocating silence. and then, like a wounded animal, Arthur Vance bolted. He lunged toward the door, shoving past Lord Ravenswood with frantic desperation. But Holmes had anticipated this. With a single swift motion, he stepped forward, precisely in Vance's path. The man barely had time to react before Holmes seized his wrist and twisted. There was a cry of pain, a sharp struggle. Then, with a final deft movement, Holmes sent him sprawling to the floor. Agnes let out a choked gasp. Lord Ravenswood took an unsteady step back. Holmes, ever composed, straightened his cuffs. "You see, Watson," he said mildly, as though discussing a chess game. "The trick to catching a magician is to simply stop looking at the illusion." Vance groaned, his face twisted in agony. Holmes turned to Lord Ravenswood. "My lord, if you would be so kind, I believe Scotland Yard should be notified at once." The final blow. The echoes of Arthur Vance's struggle had long faded, swallowed by the cavernous halls of Ravenswood Manor. Outside, dawn's first light crept through the heavy curtains, casting pale streaks upon the polished floor. The night of shadows and secrets had passed, leaving only the weight of truth in its wake. Lestrade arrived within the hour, his usual bluster somewhat subdued by the grim circumstances. He took one look at the defeated figure of Vance, now restrained, in one of the Manor's high-backed chairs, and exhaled through his nose. "Holmes," he muttered, rubbing his temples, "why is it that every time I come to one of your cases, I find a man either dead or tied to a chair?" Holmes smirked, standing with his hands behind his back. "Because, my dear Lestrade, that is when you find the case solved." Lestrade shot him a weary glare before turning to Lord Ravenswood. "I'll take him to London. Should be a clear charge. Murder, with evidence to spare. Though I dare say we'll have to comb through these passageways. For anything else he might have been hiding." Holmes inclined his head. "I suspect you will find ledgers, debts, and desperate bargains. His fall into ruin was inevitable. Eleanor's inheritance merely offered him an opportunity to delay the inevitable. Had she vanished entirely, he might have forged documents, stolen from the estate, or even blackmailed our dear Lord Ravenswood here into maintaining his silence." Lord Ravenswood, still pale, lowered himself into a chair. "I knew Vance had been struggling, but I never imagined—" He ran a hand through his thinning hair, shaking his head. "He was more than a steward. He was a friend, which is precisely why Eleanor did not suspect him at first," Holmes said. "Trust blinds even the wisest among us. Vance used that to his advantage. But in the end, Miss Ravenswood saw through his act, only too late to save herself." Agnes, who had remained silent, suddenly lifted her gaze. "And what of Miss Eleanor now?" she asked softly. She deserves a proper farewell." Holmes's expression, usually unreadable, softened by the smallest fraction. "Indeed," he murmured, "a proper farewell she shall have. With the truth laid bare, she may rest in peace at last." Lestrade signalled his men, and they hauled Vance to his feet. The man, once so controlled and cunning, now looked utterly broken. He did not speak as they led him from the manor, his footsteps echoing like a funeral march. As the door closed behind them, silence settled once more. A reflection by the hearth. That evening, Holmes and I found ourselves before the great stone fireplace of Ravenswood Manor, the flames casting a warm glow upon the cold truths of the past 24 hours. I swirled the brandy in my glass, staring into the embers. You knew from the moment we arrived, didn't you? Holmes, lounging in an armchair, gave a ghost of a smile. I suspected. The case had the air of theatre. A vanishing act. A house full of hidden passages and a missing woman who knew too much. The question was not who committed the crime, but how he had hoped to conceal it. I exhaled, and Eleanor's message, it was him. She meant to write Vance's name, didn't she? Holmes nodded. A cruel irony. She knew the truth, but her final clue was incomplete. Still, it was enough. I shook my head. It is unsettling, Holmes. The mind of a man like Vance, someone willing to kill for nothing more than coin. Holmes studied me for a moment before replying, "Greed is as dangerous as any weapon, Watson. It turns loyalty into betrayal, friends into foes. But in the end, even the cleverest of villains cannot escape justice." I took a slow sip of my brandy, letting his words settle. Then, with a small chuckle, I glanced at him. "And what of you? Not even a hint of triumph?" Holmes smirked. "My dear Watson, the satisfaction is in the game itself. The rest is merely procedure." I chuckled, shaking my head. "One day, Holmes, I shall write of this case, and you shall have no choice but to accept your own brilliance." Holmes exhaled in mock exasperation. "A fate worse than any crime," he quipped. The flames crackled, and outside the manor stood, silent once more. The ghost of Ravenswood had been exorcised, not by superstition, but by logic. And as Holmes closed his eyes, already retreating into that labyrinthine mind of his, I knew it was only a matter of time before the next mystery beckoned us forward. For where there is darkness, there will always be a mind keen enough to pierce through it.